How did you get to New York City?
I was born in New York City. So it wasn't, I didn't have much agency. I was born Mount Sinai Hospital on Fifth Avenue. And in fact, that's the same hospital where my daughters were born. So I often say I'm one of the most provincial people you will ever meet. I live 5 or 6 blocks from where I was born, and I have moved, with the exception of going to college, very few times in my life.
We're going to talk a lot today about writing, and I always like to get the genesis story from guests about what they remember from their early life. Have you always been interested in words, in writing, in poetry? I'd love to hear that story.
I think the sad answer is yes. I'm one of those people who really can't do anything else. I mean, I can make dinner and things like that, but I always thought from the time that I learned how to read, I was so fascinated by letters, just physical letters. And I wanted to be, I even imagined myself kind of inside type as a kind of a labyrinth. And from the time I was quite small, I've been writing one thing or another and creating a world perhaps outside the world that I lived in. I mean, I was an extremely bookish child. Almost nothing happened to me when I was a child except in books.
Who, at that time when you were growing up, which authors were really resonated, or who do you remember at that age really having an influence on you?
Well, when I was really little, I think it's hard to know. When I was really little, I think I was read all the usual things, fairy tales and nursery rhymes. And my father he really liked to sing, and he had gone to a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it now, a sort of communist workers' party kind of summer camp, and where his music counselor was Pete Seeger, and he would sing me all those folk songs. And I think that had a huge influence on my ear. And then when I began to read, a book, of course, that stays very well, Winnie the Pooh and all of that. And then certainly Little Women was probably the first big book that I read. And I think that book had an enormous effect.
So your dad is going off to these communists
when he was little.
When he was little.
When he was a child, he was sent to summer camp.
Did you have a sense from early on in your education that this was what you wanted to do as an occupation, as a vocation, that this was something that you could potentially use to make a living?
I never thought about making a living, which, in retrospect seems extremely bizarre. I think I thought I knew I was a writer. I think what I really would have wanted to be was a ballet dancer. I took dance for many, many years. I think it was a huge influence on me, but I was completely without talent. But I think that the structure of ballet and also of being made to practice the piano had an enormous effect. I had a very old-fashioned childhood, as you're probably gleaning. And my parents came from a world where it was not, I'm not that old, but it is important to remember that it wasn't, for example, until 1972 in this country where women had their own credit cards. So I was brought up by a mother who did not have her own credit card and did not have her own name on checks. So it was never discussed with me how I was going to earn a living, ever. So it didn't cross my mind. I went to college. I was kind of the poet in college, and graduated, and then series of events. I enrolled I was given a very nice scholarship by the Columbia MFA program, and all I wanted to do was come back to New York. I'd been in Cambridge, and I wanted to come back to New York. And I came back because I got this fellowship at Columbia, the intervening couple of months there. And I realized that I was going to have to get a job because I had no money. I mean, I literally had no money. At that time, I really was not on speaking terms with my father for one reason or another. And I would go to visit my grandmother, and she would slip, bills into my backpack. But that was not a way to live. And so I decided, and sort of at the beginning of graduate school, they gave me a full scholarship, but there was no stipend. And I thought I would get a job. And, I really do feel that, what I'm talking about is so remote now from everybody's experience now. It was a different world. I was completely unaware of a certain kind of privilege, which now I find myself ashamed of not being aware of. But it was a very different world. It was a smaller world. There was no internet. I decided I needed a job because I had literally no money. I was in a borrowed apartment and tiny little walk up on West End Avenue. And I applied to, this is all in, I think it's in my book, An Enlarged Heart, a Personal History, the last section. I applied for 5 jobs or 4 jobs. I thought, okay, what are the interesting places of someone who likes to write? So I applied to the New York Times, Farrar Straus Giroux, Vogue, and the New Yorker. I wrote letters on my father's old typewriter, which I had, and I typed them and I put them in the mail. And then I got 4 letters back 4 or 5 days later, inviting me for interviews, and I got 4 jobs. Now, that is a fairy tale now. Yeah. It's an absolute fairy tale. And it wasn't because I was so fabulous. It was just everyone I knew got jobs, whether it was at Newsweek or they went to law school. It just wasn't, it was a very, very different time. And I walked, as I've written about, went to an interview at the New Yorker, and I got elevator door open, and there was this ratty couch in the hallway, and I just fell in love the way you fall in love with a person. Didn't even remember, there's no internet. When I started at the New Yorker, there was no masthead. There was no table of contents until right before I got there. And pieces were talk of the town, so on. Nothing was signed. And the long pieces, your name appeared at the end. So it was as though it was a mythical place. It didn't occur to me that actual people work there. And I entered that world when I was 22. And I entered into, a kind of island of, what would be the word? A kind of, it was a little bit like going into a monastery. I mean, not a monastery with the usual rules, but a monastery. And it was headed by a leader, William Shawn, who gathered the people around him who he kind of touched with his sword. And that's where I grew up as a writer. So it was a very odd place that does not exist anymore.
You mentioned that there was no conversation with your parents about how you would make a living, about money, about that aspect of life. I'd love to, if you're comfortable sharing, talk about the culture at that time. If the assumption was just tacitly you'll get married and a man will provide money for you, what was the default option typically?
I mean, I really often think about it, and my friends and I think about it. I came from a culture in which it was not considered, people did not talk about money. It was not spoken of. What things cost, what people made, nothing. It was just tacit. And I didn't grow up. I want to dispel any illusion. I mean, my parents were upper middle class. They were not, they were modest. And my father had very, when he graduated from law school. He went to work for the New York Port Authority because he believed in public service. This was not, this was not Gatsby. But it just wasn't mentioned. I do think certainly there was every expectation that I would get married and have a family, but that was not talked about particularly either, and it's not something I thought about. I was pretty single-minded about writing poems.
I would love to talk about that impulse. I know you have written in many different formats before, but the attraction for you regarding poetry, what about that medium, as you think back on your life, your career, why was poetry such a draw for you personally? What about it was so captivating that has led you to spend so much of your life reading it and producing it
and teaching it? That's an interesting question, Dan, and I have to think for a minute about how to answer it. I think it was just something that I did, the way other people throw a ball, or go to the piano at the age of 4, and they start playing the piano. I can't really account for it. My grandfather wrote poems. On my father's side of the family, almost everybody painted or wrote, or they when my great grandparents on that side, on my grandmother's side, first came to this country, which was right at the turn of the century, the first thing they did was buy a piano. So it was artistic milieu. So nobody really questioned that I could write poems, and I think it was never a decision for me. I always was just, that's what I did. I know that sounds a little bald, but a lot of the things that I've done as a writer, I would not have expected. I came to the New Yorker. I had never written any prose except for school papers, Coleridge's Winding Stair or whatever. I had to do, at that point when I was in college, you had to write a junior paper and you had to do this. And, it was pretty strict. And I did all that work as an undergraduate, but I never wrote a film review for the Harvard Crimson, or it just wasn't my world. I had nothing to do with it. And then, so it is much more unexpected for me that I became a journalist, an essayist, a reviewer. It is extremely unexpected that I became a novelist. And I just wrote, and it was produced last weekend, an opera libretto. So these things are much more surprising to me. And I like trying new things, but the poetry has always been like breathing for me. It's the way that I think about the world or make sense of the world. Now, these other forms also have become that. But I've taught, somebody was asking me, I was giving a book talk the other night in Connecticut at a bookstore, and somebody asked something about, there's been a lot of talk about poet as novelist, and the idea that my prose is very lyrical. I have no comment on that particularly, but I think it's actually more astute in a way to say journalist as novelist. Writing a novel is a kind of reporting. It may be a fictional reporting, but you're trying to get at the truth of something. And of course, you're trying to get at the truth of something in a poem, but it's much more cogent. It's much smaller. It's a kernel. I mean, I'm not Milton. I don't write epics. My poems tend to be, page or two. But I think that it's more of, I learned how to become a journalist at the New Yorker. I had the most extraordinary education there. I came in not ever thinking of writing things. And then, of course, it very quickly dawned on me that the cool thing to be at the New Yorker was a writer. And, I did this. I was in the typing pool for about a minute, and then I was put in as a second assistant to William Shawn. And because I was so young, I just tried to write talk of the town stories, and I put them on his desk. Which is, when you look back on it, pretty astounding. But I was so young, and I would try these, and he would write back. He would put them back on my desk, not quite right, and I kept doing them, and then I did them. I began to do them, and then I began to write notes and comment, which was a short phase as a political writer. And then he asked me whether I wanted to be a writer. I went to work in the fiction department for a little while, and then he asked me, do you want to be a writer or an editor? And of course I said writer. And then he said, at that time, the wonderful writer, Kennedy Fraser, was writing about fashion and clothes. And he said, well, Miss Fraser doesn't want to do that anymore. Would you like to take it over? At those years, still a little bit, as you can see, I wore a lot of get-up. So he said, I think you might be interested in clothes. Would you like to take that over? If he had said to me, do you want to, take over the agricultural reporting, for the farms in Iowa, I would have said yes. It wouldn't have mattered what he said. But so I started doing that, and I learned how to do it.
I would love to go back to the time in your first years being at the New Yorker. I forget if it was in the 70s or the 80s. In the 80s. That's what I thought. I read a piece of yours yesterday describing New York in the 80s, and you've alluded a couple times in this conversation to how different the world was then compared to now. The city of New York itself, during that time, what stays with you about what you remember when you were beginning your career in the 80s at the New Yorker, living here? What would you see on the streets? What memories resonate to this day about that time?
One thing I do want to be clear about, and it is a difficult thing to parse, is that we were much more insular in those days, and the New York that I am describing is not everybody's New York. Yeah. It was an insular world. And I was not as aware, and I don't think many people were in these days, of all the other worlds of New York. So many people were much more aware than I was, and still remain much more aware than I am of these kind of things. So when I'm describing New York, I want to make clear it's a particular New York that I experienced when I was young, which was not everybody's New York. I entered a very small world as a young person of the New Yorker magazine, and kind of my friends from college, all of whom went, or most of whom went, and some of them founded Spy magazine, other worked at Newsweek. It was a very literary. One of my oldest friends was the international editor of Newsweek, and she married a college friend of mine who became the first African-American editor of Newsweek. So you see what I'm saying. It was a kind of a very literary world, I think. And, also I was very young. So there was to me, I had grown up in New York till I was 6 or 7. My parents had moved to Long Island. I'd gone to college. I'd come back. And, it would seem very glamorous to me and very intriguing. And I also thought that it was very difficult. I found it hard at that time. One of your topics, I was living in this borrowed walk-up apartment, and I was by far the youngest person at the New Yorker until the appearance, I guess, 6 months after, of writers. Of Bill McKibben, who then became a very close friend of mine at the time, and we would go around New York together quite a lot. But I had no idea how I was going to get from this tiny little walk-up to having any kind of life that everyone around me had. And I remember saying to a writer who was probably 40 years older than I am. What happens? And she said, well, it comes. And I thought that was absurd. But now that's what I say to people. It does come. I'm not exactly sure how, but there was a kind of feeling in some ways it was an interesting thing, because almost everyone that I knew in my so-called work life, though the work life and the social life were very combined, many of them had just come also as young people to the New Yorker, and they've been there for 30 or 40 years. And that's what I thought was going to happen to me. And as I'm sure you know, the New Yorker went through a huge amount of upheaval and is quite changed now. And so that the New Yorker magazine of William Shawn does not exist. And those people have, to some extent, been scattered to the winds, although we do get together, once a year, a lot of us. So it was a different kind of time in which, I'll give you an example. A joke about William Shawn was that there was no such thing as a hook for a story. A story was a story because it was interesting. So if you went to Mr. Shawn and you said, I'd like to, I want to write a talk story. You always had to ask, a talk story about this bagel shop and it's having its 100th anniversary. He would say, let's do it next year. It was just there was no feeling of celebrities. There was nothing having to do with that. I mean, you would write a profile of an actor or an artist or something, but also remember there were so few venues. We had 3 or 4 television stations. There weren't, there was Vogue, there was the New Yorker, there was people who read Time and Newsweek. That was kind of it. So the amount of influence that was yielded was huge. But at the magazine itself, the magazine always felt like a byproduct of the creative work that was going on there. And no one, it was the journalism that was really respected was Lillian Ross's journalism, in which the writer never appeared in the piece when you were reporting, ever. It wasn't about the writer, it was about the subject. It's a very different world now.
You mentioned that there were people who had worked there for 30 or 40 years and that you thought that might be you as well.
The world hadn't changed so much now. Most people, their fathers went to work, whatever they were doing, in an ad agency or a law firm or something, and they stayed there their whole lives. People didn't move around from jobs, and people who'd been at Newsweek or the New Yorker or the New York Times, they stayed there forever. They had 45-year careers. That's almost unknown now. Now it's much more about the individual moving from place to place than it was about the institution. So it's very different. And there certainly when I was at the New Yorker in those very early days, I remember one editor who was a dashing young man of probably seemed immensely old to me. He was probably 38. And the New York Times had just started doing the style section, magazine part thing. And they had different people from different jobs, model some clothes, designer clothes. Designer clothes barely existed. And he did that, and he got a note from Mr. Shawn saying, do not do that again. You are not a public figure. So there was just this frowning on any kind of putting yourself forward. It was unseemly. I think many of us, that's been a hard thing to shake. I still don't have a website because I think of it as self-advertisement. I'm told that is completely ridiculous, but it's just so bred in the bone.
What do you make of that cultural shift from these stories of writers who barely appear at all, and if they do, at the very end of the essay or the article, who are not known, who are chastised for trying to be a bit more known perhaps than they are? I don't know how much you thought about this, but just the change in culture from that time to now, and what has caused that, what you think that's done to New York culture, to American culture. I'd love to hear what you think about that.
I think what matters is the work, not the personality of the person who did the work. And I think we have now a cult of personality. And I wrote a number of profiles of artists, some who were not so well known when I did them, and some who were very well known. But the point was, it wasn't about my relationship with them. It was really focused on who that person was, whether it was Maurice Sendak or Mark Rylance, Olafur Eliasson, just to name a few. It wasn't about how we had this fun conversation. Who is interested in that? I am not. I want to learn about the other person, and the way to learn about another person is often just by sitting very still and not doing very much talking. That's kind of gone with the wind as a interviewing technique, I think. I mean, you're doing a very good job of it, but so I think it's this. Everything is about the individual rather than about what's outside the individual. Of course, what's outside of us is what's really interesting. Yeah. Where all of us, we can be, as my students might say, very unique. But really what's interesting is looking outside and paying attention, not putting oneself forward, I think. It's the work that counts, not the person who made the work.
What do you think we have lost from that transition as a people, I don't want to overstate this point, but just that shift, just in reading personally about different generations, different times in the U.S., this was a very famous book, but the book Quiet by Susan Cain, where she contrasted the culture of character versus the culture of personality, roughly speaking. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to add about, even in your lifetime, it seems like a clearly noticeable difference between more of an emphasis on the work, on disappearing as a writer, as a worker, and the Instagram celebrity era of today.
Well, I think we're in an age of self-advertisement. Yeah. Everything is about the individual. And while, a really wonderful thing, of course, is that we have all different kinds of voices and voices that weren't heard, and we want to hear those voices, but we want to hear what they have to say, not so much the personal story. It's I think there's just an overemphasis on I'm trying to think of the word, sorry. I'd rather read the book than hear about the person who wrote the book, and I think there's just, people being on Instagram, there seems to be no private life anymore. Every single thing that a person does is advertised. There's, as we know, there's no privacy at all. Even if we think we're living a private life, we're not. It's being documented in every way. The Stasi would have been thrilled that people are just volunteering for this kind of thing. So there's again, sort of advertisements for myself versus what is this book? How does it speak to all of us? Because, underneath, we all have the same concerns no matter who we are. We want to figure things out. We want to document who loves us and who doesn't. All of these things, heartbreak, birth, death, these are commonalities. And I think that gets lost.
I'd love to go back to your writing career and your trajectory at the New Yorker. Obviously, there's a lot to cover, but the personal trajectory from the time where you enter the New Yorker, and it sounds like you're surrounded by a bunch of extremely talented people who are helping to mold and cultivate your career.
Well, I think they were very interested in their own careers. I'm not sure how interested they were in mine, but I will say that, I had wonderful editors. I had friends there who read everything I wrote and edited it informally. I had wonderful editors. Every piece was edited by about 5 people. So you learn how to be concise. You learn how to be clear. You learn how to be straightforward. You learn how to write beautiful sentences that aren't showy, if you can. These people were an amazing example to me. I also saw that it was a difficult life. Many of the women who were older than I was at the time did not have families, or if they did, these were very ruptured, or they didn't have children, or they didn't have long-term relationships. And I think I found that very frightening. It seemed at that point, remember a lot of these women were 10 or 20 years older than I was. It really was a trade-off.
You mentioned before we started recording that you have 4 kids. And I'm always fascinated to hear about how the experience of raising a family in this city. I think you just used the word terrifying, the prospect of having a career that the trade-off would be never having that. How were you able to make that work? And did you ever seriously consider going the route of just dedicating yourself to your career to give yourself more time, more energy for writing? I'd love to hear how you thought about that.
Dan, I'm a pretty thoughtless person in a way. I don't really plan. I have 4 children, 1 daughter from each of my marriages, and then 2 stepchildren from my second husband who have been with me a great deal from the time they were 2 and 6, and now they're in their 30s. And I'm still very close to them. I'm their parent. They have 3 parents, and one of them is me. But I certainly didn't plan that. And then my second husband and I had another child. So at one point I had in my house 4 children under the age of 12. But one thing, I was just saying this to a young friend of mine, I had my first child when I think I was 32. And by that time I was married, and I was a staff writer at the New Yorker, and I had 1 book of poems published and another one coming out. So I did feel that I could kind of ride on that for a while. And at that point, I can't remember exactly what, that was right after, and also William Shawn had left the New Yorker. And I think right about then I started teaching at Princeton. Teaching has been the other thread in my life. I started teaching at Princeton because I wasn't at the New Yorker, and later I taught at the Columbia School of Journalism. So that was always a way of making a living. But I've never thought for a moment, I wish I didn't have children so I could devote myself to my writing. I wouldn't give up a second of that. And I didn't make that choice. I had never really thought about having children. And then after I got married and I was in my late 20s, I decided I did, like many women do with that. You may be familiar with the biological clock. I was, okay, it's time. And then I did have a baby, and then I inherited these 2 other children, my stepchildren. And then I wanted another one. When my youngest child was about 2, I turned to my husband and I said, I want another one. And he said, absolutely not. We're raising 4 children in New York, and we are not going to raise 5. And I think he was right. But of course, if I had had that child, I would still have it. I wouldn't have given it back. So, yeah. Raising children in New York is fine.
With that amount of personal responsibility and love, I'm sure. I mean, it sounds like there was a bit of it wasn't a trade-off. It was something you really wanted to do and felt an instinct to do, a calling to do. With such a large family, did you take large sections of time off in your life to be able to handle the responsibilities of motherhood? Did teaching really help make that more possible in a relatively comfortable way? What do you remember from that time?
What do I remember from that time? I remember, I just wrote about this, I think, in the Paris Review. You know, we drove our cars into the ground. I think the last one that we had together, the engine fell out on Park Avenue. I mean, we were really making ends meet. Yeah. You know, I think all the money that I made during that time went to the children's school tuition, every single penny. I would say there was a decade in there where after my youngest child was born and I was not teaching at Princeton, I went back to the New Yorker for about 6 years, doing a lot of profile writing. And I never really took any time off, but I will say that I didn't write any poems during probably those 8 years. I just didn't have the imaginative space. I could do reporting. That was fine. And I wrote the beginning of The Enlarged Heart, and then during the end of that decade, I finished it, those essays. But it wasn't until probably about 2009 that I guess it was The Watercourse was published in 2002, but the Ada Poems was published in 2010 or 11. I kind of didn't get back to... It was hard to have the imaginative space. Reporting's different. You have a subject, you can go out, you can report, you can do that. And I did it. And I loved doing it. And I had wonderful, wonderful subjects and wonderful time with it and important friendships that came out of that. You know, I wouldn't give that up, but it was not a time where I had the imagination to go back to my own work. And that was one of the reasons at that time I left the New Yorker. Again, in order to write the Ada Poems and Enlarged Heart, which I had a contract for, which I had to fulfill. So I guess I was away from the New Yorker then for about 5 years. But I'd also started teaching at Yale in 2007, where I'm still teaching. I've been there now for, I think, 18 years. So Yale became the sort of the bigger institutional allegiance. And then I went back to the New Yorker in 2013. They asked me to come back. It was because for Elias, and they wanted to do a story. He was doing something at the Paris climate talks with icebergs, and they wanted him to do an interview, and he said he would only do it with me. And they called me and said, would you please come back and just do this one interview? And I remembered how much I liked reporting. And that led to sort of 5 years of huge amount of book writing and theater reviewing. And then again, when I realized I wanted to really turn my attention to Inverno, which is the novel that came before Estate, and then this next thing, I moved away from doing that kind of reporting.
I've loved your magazine for a long, long time. And probably my favorite section, this won't be a huge shock to you given what I do for work, is the profile section. And I know you've done a lot of work in that department. Are there certain people that you got to meet for that kind of work that have really stayed with you? Stories from people you profiled that you still talk about to friends at dinner that had such amazing lives, such interesting observations about life that still resonate at this point with you?
I think all of them. it was very different then. You could take 1.5 years or 2 years to write a profile, and it was very long. So I spent a lot of time with my profile subjects. When I came back later and I did a lot of theater reviewing, I wrote sort of shorter profiles. And those people have stayed with me too, some of them. But I think with each one, the very first profile I wrote was of an actress called Linda Hunt. I don't know if you know her. She came to sort of prominence years ago in a movie called The Year of Living Dangerously with Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver. And she played a character called Billy Kwan, and she was the first person to win a Oscar for playing the role of someone in the opposite sex. And I did a profile of her, and Linda's a fantastic actress and a extraordinary phenomenon. She also was born with a kind of pituitary imbalance, so she's quite small. And, that was the first profile I did. I was probably 28 or something, very young, and spent a huge amount of time with Linda. And still to this day, things that she said to me resonate. One was that, she really wanted to be an actress, but how was she going to get parts? She was, for the screen, not your typical pinup girl. And she was fortunate enough to grow up in Westport, where there was and I think there still is, a marvelous regional theater, the Westport Theater. And she started out there as a child, and then she got these records of Laurence Olivier, and she studied them, and she copied his voice. And she said, I remember her saying, it's in the profile, it wasn't going to be enough for me to grow up. I was going to have to be a duchess. And that's what she did. And then, and that wonderful, wonderful play of Wally Shawn's Aunt Dan and Lemon was written for Linda Hunt. And the role of Aunt Dan, it's extraordinary. I hope that gets revived. And it's perfect for our time. It's about fascism. And another thing she once said to me is, everybody, which I always think all the time, everybody's always saying, it could be more, it could be more. Well, it could be more, but then it won't be itself anymore. And I really think of that quite often. And with Maurice Sendak, I was just telling I guess because my partner's grandchild was being read The Nutshell Library, and about Pierre, the lion who didn't care. And I was taking a walk with Maurice, and I said to him, my parents would torment me with that as a child, because I would say, I don't care. They'd say, look what happened to Pierre. He got eaten by a lion. And I said, Maurice was so stricken by that I would have been sort of tortured as a child by his character. So, I mean, these have been wonderful relationships and wonderful privileges to spend that much time with someone. And just, but my technique, I've never used a recorder, and I've always used a pencil. And, my technique is simply to be very quiet and sort of wait for the mouse to come out of the hole.
You said it was not uncommon for these pieces to be allocated 1.5 to 2 years to create them, to make them, the profile piece.
Allocated. You could take, I cannot, it is, well, when you have time, you can read the last section of Enlarged Heart, which is actually called Mary McCarthy's Chest. I had always swore I would never write about the New Yorker, and this turned into a piece about the old New Yorker. There wasn't a deadline. You just walked in and said to Mr. Shawn, Dan Riley. And he'd say, okay. And that was that. And then you went off and did it. Most of my profiles were, is that true? Yeah, many of things that I suggested, but in a couple of cases, I was asked to do a profile of Olafur Eliasson, who was not famous at the time. And I had to figure out how to do that because I didn't know his work. with Maurice, of course, everyone knew his work, so it was the opposite problem, trying to find out who the person was. I remember when I went to write the profile of Maurice, I went through my house. I have a house in Harlem. It's 4 stories. And I went, and I had brought up 4 children there. So I went through the house, which is my library is extremely disorganized. And I went through the house and I got to the top floor and I had 25 books that had either been written or illustrated or both by Maurice Sendak. And I sat down on the floor and I read them and I thought, oh my, this is very dark. I'm about to enter something very dark. And that was true. But it was a surprise to me that I became a journalist and a critic and I'd always loved the theater. My grandmother had been both a dancer for Martha Graham and we have a wonderful picture of her as Ophelia in the Yiddish theater in 1921 down in Henry Street. So, I was taken to the theater all the time, but I didn't have any plans to become a theater reviewer. And I did that for a while and I loved that. But that really does have deadlines because you have to actually, the thought is that you should review the play while it's at least still going, which is a little bit of a stretch often for me.
You said it was also a surprise to you that you became a novelist.
Yes.
And I would love to talk about this baby that we have in front of us. How did this book come about?
Well, it's a little hard to talk about Estate without talking about Inverno, to an audience who hasn't seen either of them, or maybe some of them have. Maybe I have readers out there. I had a huge, for various reasons, I had a huge mess of prose. I had begun kind of trying to write a letter to somebody. This was years ago, really years ago. And it stopped being a letter. It became a huge piece of prose, telling stories, making things up, all kinds of things. But it was really a lot. And I didn't know what to do with it. I had never thought that I would write a novel or sit around thinking, oh, I'm going to write a novel. I have lots of friends who are novelists. It never occurred to me I would write a novel. But I did have all this prose, and I would show it to different friends, among them, let's say, Michael Cunningham and so on. And they basically all said the same thing. Well, sweetheart, it's really beautiful, but what is it? It's nothing. It was just prose. But like John Updike, I have never written anything I didn't see in 12-point type. So I didn't know what to do. And I kept trying to take it apart and put it together and see what there was. There were fairy stories in there, all kinds of stuff, songs. And then Leanne Shapton, who is a brilliant writer and editor and is now the art editor of the New York Review of Books, is a friend. And she was looking at it. She said, stop trying to put it together. Try taking it apart. So I took it apart and I made all these different sections of the story. There was a story about a relationship between 2 people called Caroline and Alistair. There was a long business about the Snow Queen, a long business about Peer Gynt, all kinds of things. I took that all apart, whittled it down, and then I put it together. And I have a wonderful agent in London, Luke Ingram. He's my English agent at the Wiley Agency. And we sat down and we drew the structure of the book that became Inverno on a napkin in a restaurant in Sloane Square. We just drew it out. And then I kind of had something, and that turned into Inverno. But I really, that came out in January 24 from FSG, the extraordinary Jonathan Galassi. Loved it. And then I had a lot left. And I thought, oh, forget it. It's just... And then I realized that Inverno is this character, Caroline. It really takes place. It is a very New York book. It takes place in Central Park in a snowstorm. And it's really her thinking the whole time about her life and going back to her life and her attachment to Alistair, who grew up on the Upper West Side, on Riverside Drive. So it's a story about the two of them as it unfolds over time, but it really takes place almost the whole time she is waiting for a phone call in Central Park in a store. And then I had all of this left, and it's in the third person. There's an omniscient narrator, and the omniscient narrator is telling the story of this relationship and other things to somebody else, to an interlocutor. And that interlocutor is Italian. And then it seemed to me, from everything that was left, that Caroline just wanted to talk. She didn't want her story told. She wanted to tell it herself. And so I started fooling around with what I had left and, of course, making up more things as I went along. That is the unbelievable thing about fiction. Unlike journalism, you can just make things up. You can decide what kind of sandwich she was eating. It's not he's eating a chicken salad sandwich. It could be anything. It's remarkable. And so I sent that to my agent, and he said, just keep going. Who knows what's going to happen? I kept going, and that became Estate. And so we have that in front of you now, and it is the story of Caroline's relationship with the interlocutor of to whom the omniscient narrator is telling the story in Inverno. So it's not a sequel. It's, if you can imagine, it's something else. It's sort of like a mirrored compact with two mirrors. It takes place at exactly the same time, except it goes from April to August of that year. And it's about her relationship with the main character. At this point, Caroline is separated from her husband. She has a number of children, and she is in love with someone called Lorenzo, who is also seeing two other women. So it's a complicated, it takes place basically in New York, in Rome, on the beach a little bit, in Mattapoisett. And it is about, it was interesting. I was having an interview with a young woman, a magazine called Flaunt in California, which is an LA magazine. And she was quite interested in the character, and we were talking about it. And I said, one thing about Caroline is she is not going off into the woods or to a hotel or to Sicily in order to find herself. She doesn't need to find herself. She knows who she is, and she's having a very complicated life in the midst of her life. She's not going outside of her life to have an adventure. Her life is an interior adventure, and she's just trying to do it at the same time that she's picking up her children at school or so on. It's interior in that way. It's not a journey book, and my partner, who's a publisher, joked at one point that, Inverno would never be a book club book because I said, why? I said, because you always have to have redemption and someone has to learn something. And he said, what does Caroline learn? And I said, nothing. But in Estate, I think she does learn something. I think she learns that at the very beginning, she says she wants to win over Lorenzo, even though she knows that what she's envisioning with him, which is the same old thing, children and towels and tablecloths, which she has not succeeded at twice, but now she's going to succeed at it. At the end, I think she realizes that love is elastic. It doesn't have to be that set way. And also one of the things I was saying to this young woman is that we live now not that we always haven't, but in an odd way, I find a very puritanical society. People have these open relationships, or they have these groups of three and all these things, but they always have all these rules. You have to tell me if you're going to do this, or this is what's allowed and this isn't what's allowed, and it's all on a piece of paper. Caroline has she's very old fashioned. She has no inkling of any of that. She makes it up as she goes along. And, my joke about her is she's never seen a plate glass window she didn't throw herself through. But, if you're going to throw yourself through a plate glass window, you have to accept that you're going to have, maybe a couple of nicks. And she accepts that. She's not because the traditional plot would be, here's Lorenzo. Many people have said, he's a cad. He is or he isn't. He's a person, And so she should renounce him at the end and realize she doesn't need to be in this, ridiculous relationship because she's going to, find herself and be an organic farmer somewhere or something. That doesn't happen. Or she's going to, he's going to realize that she's his true love and they're going to get married. That doesn't happen either. They just muddle along like most people do. It doesn't have those traditional. So she's a kind of different heroine. If she would find it very funny to be called a heroine, I think, Caroline, but her way of being in the world has a great deal of agency, and she takes responsibility for her choices, even if they're bad.
I always love hearing about artists and their habits when they're making their work. I don't know if you have a rigidity to the months where you're creating something like the novel we've been talking about. I'd love to hear about how you structure your days, and maybe there is no structure, but over the years of your productivity, what works for you? What kind of routines or atomic habits help you end up with a work in front of you?
Dan, I am a very bad example and a total loss. I have no structure. I live between, at this point in my life, I live between New York. My partner has a place in the country up in Armenia and New Haven. And I am basically in my car. And I have a very big piece I'm working on for Harper's, and pretty much once about Doris Lessing, and pretty soon I'm just going to go into a kind of cave to do it. Though how I'm going to do that over the holidays is a little remote for me, but I will do it. I have never not finished something I said I was going to do. So I will do this. My last long essay was on Virginia Woolf and fascism. I did it. I finished it and I did it. The libretto for the opera, which just went up, which I'm really pleased about because that was a totally new thing. I did write the whole draft when I had been sort of invited very luxuriously to a retreat artist residency in Croatia 2 years ago, and a year and a half ago, and I wrote the libretto there. That was one of the tasks I set to do, although I was also rewriting Estate during that time. So when I have something I need to finish or do, I kind of go into a mode of just, that's what I'm doing. With Estate, I had agreement for 2 books with FSG, which was very kind of them. And before I wanted to finish Estate before Inverno came out, because I thought if it's a disaster, I'll never finish it. So I got up at 5 every morning last fall, and I finished it. I would work from 5 to 9, and then I would get in the car and I would go to Yale. And then at Yale, I have a place that I work, and that's what I did. And there are some sections in Estate that I had to work very hard on because they're about Caroline's fixation from the time she was a little girl on language and the shapes of words, shapes of letters, and also about labyrinths and communication theory, which I had to be taught. And so I spent a long time with a friend, an architect, figuring out the structure of the mazes, and another with a old student who's now in a physics program at Harvard, and he taught me the physics. So there was a lot of learning to do, and as usual, a huge amount of rewriting. But I kind of go into a space where that's what I'm doing. But I don't, in the best of all possible worlds, I would get up in the morning and I would do that for 3 hours, and then I'd make a nice lunch, and then I'd read a book that I'm going to review, and it doesn't work that way. I'm always just dealing with life as it comes at me, and then now I'll go to the island called Harper's Magazine essay or Virginia Woolf, and I'll go to that island and I'll finish it, and then I'll come back out. It's not a very organized way of working.
You know a lot of people in the literary world, and I asked you this question, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, who are the journalists, the writers who you trust, who you enjoy, maybe outside of your friend network? I don't know if there are figures in journalism that when people come to you and ask you for trustworthy figures who are writing today, or just enjoyable authors and journalists, who comes to mind? Are there individual writers who you recommend, who you admire, to people who are curious about that space, who are looking for trustworthy journalists writing today?
Well, when you say trustworthy, I'm not a political reporter. Yeah. So that I think there are a lot of trustworthy journalists, probably chief among them right now, Heather Cox Richardson, and probably the people who are writing for the Contrarian and some people for the Times who are trying to save democracy, barehanded. We're living in an absolutely terrifying and unspeakable and unusual time in this country. And I think we really have to be all hands on deck. I don't usually write political pieces, but I did write this long piece that was just in the Los Angeles Review of Books about charting the rise of fascism through the diaries of Virginia Woolf. And she sees it, she sees it coming. And what's happening I think we're in about 1938. That's where we are, maybe 39 at this point. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully we can turn this ship around. But as I say, I'm not a political journalism, so those don't tend to be my go-to idols. I mean, I think there are some, as far as writing on politics, I would say Linda Greenhouse is extraordinary. There are a number of writers at The New Yorker who are not personal friends with Marcus. Certainly Sarah Stillman is an extraordinary journalist. She does happen to be a friend. As far as what we might call more literary journalism, one of the most, I think, wonderful writers who has written many books and is not one of the great prose stylists of the last, 40 years is Alec Wilkinson, Sandy Fraser, Judith. A lot of these people are at this point my friends, because I grew up with them. It's a kind of, and they're one of the really, really wonderful younger writers. Is Francesca Wade, who just published recently a big biography of Gertrude Stein and wrote a book called Square Haunting. I think she's in her late 30s, about Mecklenburg Square and the women writers who lived there. And she is a really consummate stylist and writer, which is unusual these days. I like reading Bea Wilson in the London Review of Books. She writes a lot about food. But that's a serious subject. It's a serious subject. I think the London Review of Books is publishes probably the most lively journalism around today.
I like to close with guests with the same question, which is about how they think about the word success. And you've had a prolific career. You alluded to this multiple times during the conversation, that you have dipped your toes into many waters that you weren't necessarily expecting to. When you think about your life, when you think about your career, what does the word success mean to you as it applies to those areas of your life? It's
not a word I think about very much. I'm simply interested in getting it right on the page. And if there are a few sentences or lines of poetry that I can get behind and say, I did the best I could do. To me, that's success. I'm happy to have done this small opera. It's very exciting to hear words that you've written sung aloud. I always joke that over my desk in New York, when you're a child and you're learning to write, you get that piece of paper and it has the sort of dotted lines, and you write the big letters and the little letters.
Sure.
Kurt, remember capital letters and little letters. And I have framed over my desk my daughter Rose, who I mentioned to you earlier, who's a painter and a textile artist. It says, the cat sat on the mat, the cat saw the rat, the cat chased the rat. And I have that there because I say, really all I've been doing is trying to rhyme cat and mat my whole life. And that's it. I don't really think the success is just what there is on the page. And if people read it and respond to it, and, I've been at Knopf for many years with my poetry. It's been a wonderful privilege to work with Deb Garrison. I had wonderful editors, Virginia Cannon, who my book about Rome and Venice is dedicated to. And here FSG has done such a beautiful job publishing Inverno and Estate. But I don't really think beyond that. It's just, okay, what's next? And am I going to be able to acquit myself and really pay attention to the subject? That's what I think about, not some idea of being that would be a success. But then, the minute I'm sure other writers feel this way, the minute you finished it, okay, now there's that blank piece of paper, that blank screen, and I have no idea what I'm doing. So hope you can get through, say something.
Thank you so much for doing this. This is an honor.
Thank you very much for having me.